What is up, Optimal Health Warriors, and welcome to episode 47 of the Optimal Health Show. 7 hidden signs you might have a thyroid problem and what you can do about it. Our special guest today is Dr. Alan Christianson. He lives in Phoenix, Arizona. He's a based naturopathic doctor who specializes in natural endocrinology with a focus on thyroid. Dr. Alan is also the co-author of the #1 best-selling book, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Thyroid Disease. He has frequently appeared on national TV shows like The Doctors and Today Show, and as well print media like Shape magazine. Now, if you haven't already, please head over to optimalhealthwarrior.com and get your free Warrior Unleashed book with over 40,000 downloads. And this week's Warrior quote: "See first with your mind, then with your eyes, and finally with your body." And I like this. It's an old Japanese proverb. And I think what it really means to me is about not jumping to conclusions or not assuming things. Too much today, we always think first before we actually digest the information. And this really applies to health. You know, you see a new supplement or you see a new type of diet out there and right away you're hungry, like, oh my God, I got to go get that. Pause for a moment and really let that information simmer and digest. Once you've actually put the pieces together, then you can actually make a better calculated guess. All right, warriors, without further ado, please sit back and relax and enjoy today's amazing episode with Dr. Alan Christianson. Hey, Dr. Alan, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How you doing, Amir?
I'm good. Thanks for coming on the Optimal Health Show. And we're going to be talking about weight issues today, thyroid issues, and everything to do with hormones. I'm just kind of curious, what got you interested in the whole hormone connection with weight loss in the first place?
You know, funny thing, I think like a lot of us, our own personal journeys got us going in these ways. I think we probably, I don't know, all go into accounting otherwise, right?
Yeah.
I was a fat kid. You know, I was epileptic and I really couldn't do physical activities, but I figured out that if I ate a bunch of chocolate chip cookies, I would get kind of like a high from that, and it would make me feel good in a way, and I did it a lot. And somewhere around 7th grade, I was just like devastated about how I looked, and you know, I'm thinking about girls at this age, I'm getting more concerned about my appearance, and I really became compelled to change it. And what I did have going for me was that I could read early on, I could figure things out well. So I turned that towards the health space. And I just got literally all the books I could find on nutrition, fitness, wellness. And I went through all these things and made some plans. And I was able to turn my health around. And I kind of went into a calling in medicine because of that. But then more importantly, I realized that there's a lot of people out there to where the types of advice we hear about that are helpful so often won't always work. And there's people to where I think about like a parking brake being stuck on in the car, where no matter how polished it is or how good of octane gas it is, it's not going to go very well. And I thought, wow, how as bad as it was for me and how much of a struggle it was for me, what about all those people to where those things don't work? And they try to diet, they try to exercise, but even when they stick with it, they relapse, they fall back, and they're blamed for it as if it's their personal fault. So that became my mission, to really take the parking brake off, understand these conditions better.
And when would you say you stumble around the real connection with thyroid and weight loss?
That would have been during my residency in medical school. So at that time, there was an old view on thyroid disease, which was that you really could understand it only by talking to a person and knowing their symptoms. And the old view also had an idea that you could consider many options for treatment, including natural thyroid meds. The new view, which still is very dominant, was just taking hold around that time. And the new view was that we only diagnose it based upon very strict, quite broad diagnostic guidelines, and we only give one synthetic medicine. So there was kind of this rift, and I really saw that this applied to a lot of people, and that there was really some arguments on both sides that were valid, and also some that I thought needed to go by the wayside. So I wanted to just really understand those worlds better and make a more cohesive system that could better diagnose and treat this. And I really saw that those people who had this condition most represented how I was stuck in a way that couldn't get unstuck without further guidance.
Why is the thyroid system so important to managing your weight and energy?
You know, we burn fuel for our activities, but first off, we've got to get the fuel into our cells where it can burn. Before that happens, we've got to store it. We've got to take that same calorie and make fat out of it. And your thyroid hormones, they're literally switches that put you in a state of burning or storing. And if someone's trying to manage their calorie, their metabolism, their math on what comes in and what goes out, thyroid dysfunction could mean 600-700 calories that you're just not burning, that your basal metabolism is suppressed by that much. So it's the biggest single medical factor that makes weight loss a struggle. People talk about their metabolism, their various issues, how they're different, and this is one thing that's very real and very powerful in that capacity.
What would you say are some common signs and symptoms today that may relate to thyroid issues?
You know, good question. And I distinguish between possible symptoms and then more probable or more common symptoms. Possible symptoms, I mean, you name it. So the thyroid hormones, they impact literally every cell in the body head to toe. So anything that goes wrong, it can be relevant to it. There was a big study done in Colorado in the year 2000, and they had about 25,000 people do surveys and take thyroid blood tests, surveys about their symptoms. They ran a bunch of math and found that some symptoms are better predictors than others. And one of the big ones is resistant weight gain. You know, someone doesn't get the benefits of diet and exercise. Another big one is unexplained new depression. So, you know, you didn't just have a crisis or a stressor, something shifted in your body that made you just feel worse. Unexplained onset of fatigue. Then we've got a couple that relate to our connective tissues. So hair, skin, nails, more dry, more brittle, breaking more easily. A few more connective tissue symptoms. Muscles, they cramp easily, they don't recover that well from exercise. And then digestion, so constipation, gas, bloating. And kind of a nuance is that all these things generally shift within an observable time frame. So not so much I had this stuff forever, but more so, you know, after the pregnancy or after the last 6 months, things have been different. One more nuance with that, you don't get all of them. You know, whatever reason, most commonly you get one or two of those symptoms pretty strongly, but not the others, and not the same one or two that somebody else would have.
Now, what would you recommend in today's time for testing? Like a lot of doctors will do standard testing, for example, TSH, but there's obviously much more than that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, wonderful question. The TSH, and again, I kind of have views that are different from both sides. The conventional world says that's really all that matters. Here's the broad normal range. The alternative world says, you know, ignore it completely. And I don't agree with either of those. It's a meaningful test. The range is not very useful. And it's not always the first indicator of disease, but we've got a strong sense on how TSH scores look in healthy populations. And if someone's not in that narrow healthy range, there can be a problem. That's not the only indicator. You know, it's good to also look at the structure of the gland. I encourage ultrasounds for those who are suspecting thyroid disease. I do them pretty extensively. The main disease we have happen, it's an autoimmune disease called Hashimoto's. And there's blood tests that look for the antibodies in Hashimoto's, and they're useful when they show it, but they're not useful when they don't show it, because there's about 12.5 antibodies that we know of, probably more that we don't. There's only 2 that we can test for in commercial labs, or 3 if you go a little bit outside. So they can be negative, and there still can be an immune response. So we look at the free hormones, the reverse T3, the narrow ranges of optimal, and also the thyroid structure. And those things give a better sense when disease is at earlier stages.
Can you explain a little bit more in detail about the reverse T3? Because that's not very commonly known today.
For sure. So thyroid hormones, I think about the process of making them and then utilizing them. And what goes on is that there's a protein that your body takes called thyroglobulin, and you're actually stacking iodine on thyroglobulin. And the more of those you stack on, the more of a number we've got. So these are the T numbers, like T3, T4, T2. All they are is thyroglobulin plus X number of iodine atoms. So when you're forming the hormones, you're actually putting iodine on top of it. You're going from none to 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's then a stored hormone. Then you release that, and your body is pulling them off to utilize the hormone to get the benefit out of it. So you're going 3, 2, 1, 0 to utilize it. Now, what also happens is that we have to control the hormone outside of the thyroid. It's so powerful that we control how much comes out, but also how much gets used. And one of the ways we control that, going from 4 to 3, we could take off this iodine or this iodine. And one makes the hormone powerful, one makes the hormone inactive. And it's actually a natural process. In fact, the bulk of the T4 that we make into reverse T3. We make it inactive intentionally. That's the way we've got one more regulation on the thyroid hormone. During many states of illness, however, we might make that conversion excessively, in some rare cases even too little. So getting a sense on how hormones are used in the body after they've been released, the reverse T3 measures how your body is inactivating the first hormone that's made from your thyroid.
Now let's summarize this. If someone's actually looking to get a comprehensive thyroid panel, what would they be looking for?
Ideally a TSH, a free T3, free T4, reverse T3, thyroid antibody panel, thyroglobulin. So there's anti-thyroglobulin antibody and then thyroglobulin. Those are separate. And then ideally a physical assessment, which would be an exam or better yet an ultrasound. Thyroid nodules exist in maybe even a quarter of some populations. And when they're present, they completely shift how the scores are interpreted. What's a good score without a nodule is different than what a good score is with a large calcified nodule. And the best examiners, if you take a group of people that all has nodules, the very best examiners, we're going to find about a third of them. Just to be honest, we're going to miss a lot. We can do ultrasounds and find things at a level of detail that we just can't feel perfectly with our fingers. So when there's a strong suspicion, that's a useful part of the workup as well.
What are some common things we're doing in our life today that may be causing us to have misfunctioning thyroid glands?
Very simple. There's two things that if we just stopped doing, we would not get any more thyroid disease. Number one is breathing, and number two is eating. So cut it out and you'll be fine. So the joke is that being alive in the modern world. So thyroid disease, it's an interplay between genes, the environment, and our immune systems. And our genes, they're what they are. We can't so much change them, but the environment shifts how they activate. So the genes affect what your thyroid brings inside of it. Ideally, it would just bring an iodine, but if you've got a lot of thyroid disease in your family, that mechanism, that pump, is probably not as fussy as it should be. And there's probably a lot of things that should not be brought in your thyroid that are brought in. And that can be fluoride or mercury or perchlorate. And the more we can avoid our exposure, the better. But some things we can't completely avoid. So some of it is just a matter, if we're prone to it, we'll pull things in. That third part is then the immune system. So the healthier our immune system is, the less apt it is to happen.
What's your take on certain foods?
Yeah, so our diets are hugely important. The bulk of what comes into our bodies after breathing comes in through our diets. And easiest things are just being lower on the list of processed foods. The less chemicals we consume, the more healthy fibers, the more good quality proteins, the more rich leafy greens, the less waste we'll have to process and the more waste we can eliminate, and the more sufficient we'll be on some key nutrients. So yeah, diet is very important that way.
Now, there's a huge rampant rise lately in demonizing gluten in foods, and I do agree that there is a lot of issues for a lot of people out there. What is your take on gluten and thyroid?
It's a funny thing. Sometimes I'm pathologically open and probably give out more information than I should. It's not the smoking gun. It's certainly a factor. There's some that have made out that the gluten reaction somehow causes thyroid disease. And I've done so much scouring of the medical literature to find data on that. And you've been in the health space for a bit, and there's ideas and there's hard facts. And ideas, they kind of spread through pollination. The more they get told, the more force they take on, the more they seem to be true. So I haven't found a lot of hard facts behind that. There is clearly a small overlap between celiac disease and thyroid disease. If you've got one, statistically, you're a little more apt to have another. So somewhere around 1% of the population has celiac. People with thyroid disease, it's more like 3 to 5% have celiac. So there's hard data on that. And there's also a lot of data saying that the less immune stressors we have, the better we will do if we have thyroid disease. In many people, that can be gluten. There are those that have gluten intolerance that are not celiac, so it certainly happens. Other foods can do that too. So I encourage people to really know what are the biggest factors for them and put the energy onto what's going to improve their health the most.
What's your take on iodine? Because there's like two camps. One camp is saying iodine's like the holy grail of holy grails. And the opposite camp's like, oh no, that's the demon. Don't use iodines. Obviously it has to be some kind of like fine middle ground in between those two.
This is a funny thing. So I've been focusing on thyroid disease since about 96 in my practice. And I had a patient, I'm in Arizona, and a lot of my patients, we call them snowbirds. They're here in the winter, and they're nicer places to be in the summertime. And so many of them I'll see for like half the year on and off. One guy, really cool, I actually just saw him recently. He's in his 80s, and he's as fit as any of us. I mean, just does everything right. And one year he came back down, and he had developed toxic nodular goiter, one of the rare types of thyroid disease. This particular one, it's almost always, if an older man gets it, a man in his 60s or 70s gets it, it's almost always after some big dose of iodine, and totally known. That almost always happens from contrast meds. So CT or MRI, you could contrast medications. Many of those did have iodine, less so now, and that would trigger that disease for older men. So once I saw he had this, I'm thinking a couple steps ahead, and I asked him, I said, well, did you hurt your back over the summer? What happened? And he's like, well, no. And I said, well, why did you have the CT? What was the MRI for? What were they looking at? He goes, well, I didn't have one. I'm like, well, okay, now I assume this and this and this, but why else would you have gotten this? And so we talked more, and he'd been taking this high-dose iodine supplement. And he said, yeah, I had a test done. It showed I was deficient in iodine, so I was taking the supplement because of that. I'm like, wow. And I said, well, here's the thing. This type of disease only comes on after high-dose iodine, so let me learn more about this. And you talked about the camps. That was my introduction to the iodine-loving camp. And I found a lot of the arguments compelling. And at the surface, I found a lot of them plausible. So I spent ridiculous amounts of time following through on that and interviewing all the authors in this camp, reading literally every word of all their works and all their references, following through on all the references. Now, I've got to say, most of the references were what we call circular references. They referenced the same person's work somewhere else, which referenced that work. So there were a lot of references to outside of that. So iodine, it's one of the first elements that we ever isolated, one of the first chemicals we could distinguish as being a unique element. And it's one of the first nutrients we identified. Probably 2,500 years ago, the Chinese knew that goiter, this big neck enlargement, you could cure that by giving burnt seaweed. So there was some understanding way back when, one of our first real nutrient wins. So we've got a lot of history with this. For the last century, we've put huge amounts of research into iodine and goiter, iodine and cretinism, iodine and thyroid disease. By far the most thoroughly studied mineral that we have. So there's a wonderful book called the Compendium of Iodine Disease. And it's this, you could kill a shark with this book. Seriously. And there's one graph in this book, which I love. It's like a synopsis of thousands of studies. And the graph shows, okay, with this much iodine intake, here's the rates of all-cause thyroid disease. You throw together hyperthyroid cancer, and there's strong correlations. When you're lacking in iodine, there's more thyroid disease. No debate about that. When you're excessive in iodine, there's more thyroid disease. No debate about that whatsoever. Now, those gaps, we call that one of those U-shaped curves, those curves are crazy close together. You know, I really don't make the rules around here. If I did, we'd have much more leeway on that. The gaps are really close, and the gaps are tighter for those who are apt to get autoimmune thyroid disease. We've seen places like Denmark that had high rates of goiter. They would do salt iodification. They would add iodine to the salt, which helps. But at first, the first decade, there's ridiculous rates of thyroid disease, even with reasonable amounts added to the salt. So that range, that looks like about 100 to about 300 micrograms per day. When you're below that, there's more thyroid disease of all types. When you're above that, there's more thyroid disease of all types. There's just so much data on this. It's like aspirin causes GI bleeds. It's like trying to argue against that.
And that's the problem, I think. A lot of people are either black or white, but there's different shades of gray, I like to say, right? Would you advise then to try to get your iodine source more or less from seafood instead of jumping on supplements right away?
Mm-hmm. The hard thing is that the supplement dosages, they're really on the high side of that curve, that 300 micrograms. Many supplements are dosed in terms of milligrams. There's a popular product you can find 12.5, 25, and 50 milligram doses of iodine. So that's 50,000 micrograms. The World Health Organization has said that if you don't have autoimmune thyroid disease, you could probably tolerate about 1,100 micrograms per day safely, usually. And that's well documented. So some of these new recommended doses are literally 400 times above that. They're ridiculously high. And yeah, you can get that abundantly from seafood. You have some sea vegetables every so often. Salt. The funny thing about salt is that in general, we get too much, and most of our salt's from processed foods. Well, that's not iodized. So processed foods have salt, but not with iodine. So try to get your salt more so from things you make at home. And I do like sea salt because it's about 3% magnesium. A few brands of it are iodized. So for those that don't have thyroid disease, that's a good way to go. A paradox, those that do have thyroid disease, that same narrow window applies, but thyroid replacement medications, they contain a big chunk of iodine. So those on some type of a thyroid medicine, they may be at the high end of the window after they've taken their day's thyroid pill. So in many of those cases, they're benefited by really limiting and making choices that avoid any unnecessary iodine.
What's your take on thyroid medications?
Yeah, so people that have thyroid disease, it's a problem of production of hormone and then usage of hormone. I think about it like planting a seed. You've got to have the seeds, but you can't put like 3 bags of seed in playground sand and expect to have a garden.
Of course not.
So the thyroid hormones as meds, those are seeds. And for some people, they're not making the seeds. They need more of that there. They just don't have the factory left. There's also the soil. And for all people, the usage of those hormones is relevant to how much benefit they will get, how good their body responds to it. For some people at earlier stages, it may be all about the soil. It may be the case that they do have enough capacity to work on their own, but they're not responding to those hormones adequately. So yeah, there are those that do need replacement, and there's types that are better than others, but not everyone is in that category. And even those that are, it's important to understand how they're responding to what they are taking.
Now, when you say some are better than other ones, which ones do you personally work with?
Well, there's 3 really active thyroid hormones, T4, T3, and T2. T2 might be the most important. There's also proteins that can be present in thyroid meds that can calm the immune response. So those are some differences, which hormones the medications have, whether or not they have thyroid proteins. Other differences are standardization. So natural thyroid meds, synthetic ones, within brands, both camps have some well-standardized medicines and some poorly standardized medicines. Those who are taking the meds, it's important to get the dose spot on and exactly right. And towards that goal, if I, as a doctor, I have an idea that this is a good dose for you, but each time you fill it each month, it's a little bit different. We got a moving target we're shooting at. That just doesn't work. So standardization is also important. The last big thing is inactive ingredients. So that T4, T3, and T2, they're literally microscopic. They by themselves in your hand would not be visible. So we need you to absorb them well for those who are taking them. And a big list of random things and binders and fillers can goof up that absorption. So this first part, which hormones are there, the benefit of porcine, pig-based, natural thyroid is that you've got all 3 hormones and you've got the thyroid proteins, which calm the immune response. Within types of that, there's different brands in the market. Armour is the most common in the US. It's not the best standardized. The ones that are well standardized include Nature Thyroid, West Thyroid, and WP Thyroid. And then binders and fillers, the one that has really no binders or fillers apart from medium chain triglyceride and inulin from coconut and chicory, that's WP thyroid. So it's standardized, it's clean, it's got all the hormones and the active proteins.
Now, how would you then determine which person needs that thyroid medication? Would they have to go for all rounds of testing? They do the physical testing as well, and then after they've done the diet, and if nothing has improved, then you'd put them on the medication?
Pretty much from the very beginning, I can get a sense on where they are in that continuum by their levels. You mentioned about the TSH, so that's a marker that shows how much your body asks your thyroid to work. And then we look at the free hormones, the free T3, the free T4. That's how much hormones have been released and are in circulation. So in cases when the TSH is very elevated and the free hormones are well below range, that's a case to where your body is yelling at your gland to work and it's just sputtering. It's not making a whole lot. That combination is rather rare, in all honesty, when someone's first diagnosed. There's not many that are in that scenario. Those who are, I've tried to stand on my head and wave crystals and do nutrients and detox. At some point, the factory's broken, and you could work really hard for years and years and maybe edge it up, or you could just put back what's not there, and the worst thing someone could think about in that case is they're taking a pill long term. But, we take vitamins and we do things on a regular basis. So we're probably going to take a pill of something long term. So in that case, it's not a big thing.
Have you found that any other minerals or nutrients really help in thyroid issues? I've read a lot of times that selenium is a great thing to take.
For sure. That's a great call. And again, that full-on shutdown scenario is not the most common by any means. Selenium is super important. Also a double-edged sword, but the dangerous overdose thing is much less of a concern commonly, and many people are low in that. That's a big part of, I talked about forming the hormone, kind of packing on the iodine, and then unpacking the iodine as we use the hormone. All those steps are super dependent upon selenium, and that's a really critical mineral that people can lack very commonly. One of my favorite tricks is make friends with Brazil nuts. Handful a week, and you should be in good shape on that. There still are debates about how effective selenium is, how much effectiveness versus possible toxicology it has from supplements. I think it's reasonable to get some from supplements, but certainly compensate for it with good dietary sources as well.
Now, are there any other minerals, proteins, or anything like that we should kind of be paying attention?
Good diet overall, and the more stable the blood sugar is, the better the adrenal glands function and the easier life is for your thyroid. So your thyroid hormones, they've got to cross the cell membranes before they can be used. And it's that nice ebb and flow of cortisol, that morning spike, that night shut off, that really makes the cells respond good to the thyroid hormones. So when that cortisol flow is not happening, your thyroid may have to really overcompensate because its hormones aren't getting where they're needed to be. And your cortisol ebb and flow, one of the biggest variables that affects that is your blood sugar. So the more easily your body can control your blood sugar, the less you'd have to use cortisol to keep coming in and rescuing your blood sugar.
Do you ever test cortisol levels for thyroid?
For sure. And yeah, we check that via conventional blood tests and also the salivary studies. Cortisol is very important, how much you're making in a moment, but it's super important to get how the whole day's curve plays out. And that data is crazy strong. I just finished a manuscript, where we at? March. I finished a manuscript mid-February. And so that was about like 7 months of just me geeking out on cortisol metabolism. Study in the UK, they looked at people 2002 to 2004, about, I think must have been 4,000 civil servants and pretty big range of ages and health status. And they wanted to look at which different measurements predicted death rates. Mm-hmm. And no-brainers, who smokes, who doesn't smoke, body size, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, where's your blood sugar, where's your blood pressure. This study, they also looked at that cortisol slope. They didn't do the 4 points like a lot of the NICE tests do, but they did a morning and a night test to see how the day was different from the night. And they just called that the slope or the gradient. And of all the factors that predicted death, the cortisol slope edged out everything else. No kidding. Wow. So A lot of people like, ourselves or maybe our listeners, we think so hard about, eating our broccoli and not our Twinkies, but yet we think not a lot about maybe staying up late to get something done or pushing ourselves a little more. And the crazy thing is when you line up how the effects of stress act upon your health compared to habits and lifestyle, even the big things like smoking, that whole stress response, that cortisol slope, it might trump all the rest of it.
That's a great segue to the closing caption of the show is, if you had to summarize and only give one tip of advice, what would be your number one optimal health tip to somebody?
I have a rules of health thing that I'm putting out on our Twitter account, and I put a lot of thought into what would be the first one. And the first one is, you got to be having fun. The health ritual means you're shoveling down things you don't like and you're logging time on a treadmill and you're hating it. You're not making your life better and you're not into a better chemical state. So at the same time, it's important to do things that are critical and are useful, but we've got to find a way that you can tie it into what is important to you and what does matter and what does bring you joy. So yeah, you've got to be having fun. Otherwise, nothing else is going to work.
Right on. I love it. Now, you have something special for everybody here at the Optimal Health Nation.
For sure. I've got a bunch of videos I made that talk about really how to understand the relevance of thyroid disease to your health. And this is true both for those who suspect it or wonder about it for themselves or a loved one, as well as those who already know they have it. And you asked some awesome questions. I gave some, within our time constraints, some limited questions, but all those things are taken at much, much more detail. How to really understand if this applies to you or not, how to really keep from having to develop it if you do not already, how to work with your healthcare team if this is already a factor for you. And yeah, it makes a huge difference on hitting your health goals.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely have that in the show notes. I recommend all you optimal health warriors out there, go check it out. Dr. Allen has spent quite extensive amount of time putting that together, and it's very, very valuable. So I highly suggest you go check that out. Dr. Allen, any other final thoughts?
The thing I always like to leave people with is that we're wherever we're at right now in terms of the time in the calendar, go back 1 year and what you had then, what was inside of your clothes 1 year prior, what was inside of your skin, guess what? It's not here anymore. All those atoms and molecules and cells, they've gone. They've been replenished and turned over. So the whole thing about renewal and change, it's happening like it or not. And it's going to happen good or bad. So taking time to listen to good advice like Amir and his guests are giving and to follow these types of steps, you can completely shift your body to a brand new one in a way that you want every single year. You can totally change it. So never give up on your health and know that things always can improve.
Wise words. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I wish you a great day and talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, Amir.
Bye-bye.